Does this work? Yep, y'all can hear me. So I got the good slot. I'm supposed to try and keep y'all awake after lunch. They got me all wired up here. I think one of these is the microphone and the other one shocks me if I go over time. So I got a little bit of time here. I could probably talk all day about what we did and what we saw if they'd let me, but I'll try and keep it brief. A little bit about myself. I actually grew up on a beef and sheep farm over in McDowell, Virginia. So I'm from Howland County. Some of y'all probably know where that is. I went to Virginia Tech, studied animal and poultry science as an undergrad, and graduated last May and decided to go back. I hadn't had enough yet, so I'm a grad student now doing ruminant nutrition. And this is I need some forage experience, so I went on this class this summer, and I'm really thankful that y'all were able to provide the funding. I was pretty much searching the couch cushions for money to pay my way on the trip, but y'all's donation really helped out. So let's see if I can figure out how to use this. Okay, this is just a map of the route where we went. We started out in Charlotte, North Carolina. We all met there. It was students from 6 different universities: Clemson, Virginia Tech, Texas Tech, Missouri. I think we had one girl from Arkansas. I can't remember all of them, but and our first trip we headed down into South Carolina, and there we went to Clemson University and saw some grazing trials and feeding trials they had going on. There's a dairy down there, the Happy Cows Dairy, which you'll see in a minute, and we stopped there. Went back up into North Carolina to Asheville. If any of y'all are familiar with Warren Wilson College, they are a small, I don't know exactly what their mission is, but they do a lot of work in sustainable agriculture. And the farm that's at the college actually provides all the food for the college. The campus is supposedly completely sustainable. So headed up to Knoxville, University of Tennessee. There we saw some orchard grass tests. There was turf. We did a lot of turf grass. I didn't realize how important golf courses and stuff were, but we did look at that. There's an organic farm just outside of Knoxville that was associated with the University of Tennessee. There was an organic crop farm, so they were, I didn't have any slides in here about that, but it was interesting just to see what they're trying to do to grow all these crops without pesticides, herbicides, and stuff. And some of it was successful. They were still struggling, though. Went to the Ames plantation in Tennessee, which is, that was probably my favorite stop of the whole trip. It was, I think it was 10,000, 8,000 acres or something that had been donated to the University of Tennessee. And when the funding ran short to run the place, Tennessee's told them they had to cut back or die. So they went from, I think it was 44 people working on this plantation to 18. And they really looked into how they could make profit from this piece of land. And they were grazing a lot more cattle, managing that. They had crops. They had logging, and then they brought all these grad students out that were in animal science, wildlife science, and stuff to do research. And one of the most interesting things was they had the national bird dog trials there for quail hunting, and they managed pretty intensively for quail populations. Then we were at Vivian Allen. He mentioned Vivian Allen. She was a Texas Tech professor who used to run the trip, and we stopped at her farm, and she's right there on the Tennessee-Alabama border. And we stopped there and looked at, she had some rotational grazing systems. I got into Missouri, went to the University of Missouri and Jernigan Ranch, which you'll see that later on. Then headed out into Kansas, and I think I covered most of the trips in Kansas, or most of the stops in Kansas on this slideshow. Down through Oklahoma and into Texas. So Oklahoma, we stopped at the Noble Foundation. Some of y'all might be familiar with that. And they do a lot of work with not just grazing and crops, but everything on the business side of agriculture. And the probably most interesting thing maybe we saw there was they have a big problem with wild hogs out there. So they'd come up with this trap. The conventional traps catch a single hog at a time, and what happens with those is the group of hogs sees one hog get caught, and then they won't go near the trap again. So they had developed this giant ring. It looked like a hay bale feeder, and it's set up on 3 legs. And attached to this, there was it was a trigger mounted on a T-post and a camera that looked at, so the camera was mounted facing this trap, and it was wirelessly accessible. So you could take your smartphone, you could log in, and you could watch what's on the camera. Well, the motion sensor would trip the camera, turn it on, send a notification to your smartphone. You could be anywhere. The guy said he was watching a baseball game one time, and he flipped his phone on, saw that all these hogs were under this trap eating the bait, hit a button on his phone, trap drops, he's caught 30 hogs. So, and it was extremely effective, and it was pretty cheap too for what they were doing. So that was pretty cool, and they were still doing some research with it. They hadn't really started releasing it to the public, but it was pretty promising. So let's go ahead and get started on our, well, these are our course objectives. There are 15 ecoregions in the United States. We obviously didn't cover all of them, but we were across 2 of them, which was the Great Plains and the Eastern Temperate Forest. Now, all these ecoregions are divided into level 2 and level 3 ecoregions, and I think we crossed 6 level 2 ecoregions. I can't name them all. It's just like grasslands, forest regions, savanna. So we saw a lot of different research stations, a lot of different people using different approaches to address problems within agriculture. So, and we interacted with people from all over the U.S., from some pretty high-named environmentalists to some people that were really focused on profit-driven farming systems. So, one of our first stops was the Happy Cow Creamery in Pelzer, South Carolina, and the guy that ran it, he said that he was still waiting to hear back from his lawsuit against California because happy cows come from South Carolina and not from California, according to him. But I can't remember his name, but he was at one time the top producing dairy farmer in the state of South Carolina. He had the highest yielding cows, and there's only like 44 dairy farms in South Carolina. So, but he was doing pretty good, he thought. But every year he was taking out a bigger loan to cover his costs. So he didn't know how he was going to keep up doing this. Well, one day his cows broke out, and they broke into this new field of, I think it was alfalfa or something he just planted, and he was going to cut for haylage. But he noticed that for 2 days after that, the milk yields jumped up 2 pounds a cow. So his idea was that he could stop feeding all this grain and all these crops he was harvesting and save all the money on that and just feed pasture. And he developed what he called the 12 April system, and that's not on this slide, but basically he wanted to provide forage that was equivalent to what you would see in April 12 months out of the year. And he did that through, he mixed up what he was using. He used cool season forages, warm season forages, winter annuals, whatever he could get, and he intensively planted each paddock, fertilized it, ran through it, and he rotated the cows pretty intensively through it. They would be on maybe one paddock for a day or 2 days. And through that, he was able to completely cut out his imported feed, what he was feeding that came off the farm. He was able to sell all his equipment, his planters, harvesters, tractors, and he was still maintaining high milk yields. Now, with this, he also started doing direct marketing. He took his old silo and put in a bottling plant inside the silo, which was pretty cool. The milk got pumped straight out of the barns, and then you could sit and watch through the glass as it cycled through, and they put it in bottles, put caps on it, came out, and there was a store building connected to it, and they just put it in the freezer or the cooler right there. So, but he was a very good marketer. He had a lot of local business. He had probably some of the best chocolate milk I'd ever had. He had chocolate companies from all over the world send him samples, and then he ended up choosing like 1 or 2 out of all of those. He blended these 2 and then put them in his chocolate milk. So it was pretty sweet. But from there we went to, this was the complete opposite. Tribute Farms in Benton, Missouri. I don't know if any of y'all are familiar with a New Zealand style dairy, but it's a lot more intensive. Everything is organized. They're not really focused as much on quantity of yield per cow. If they're not getting high enough yields, they'll just put more cows in the system. So this was pretty interesting. He was able to do what he did because he was about 20 feet above sea level, or above the Mississippi River. His water table was right there, and he used a lot of water. Let's look at some pictures. This is the rotary parlor. I don't know if any of y'all seen this, but this circle thing is just constantly turning, and the cows step on it at one gate. There's feed in the middle, and they ride it around. There's people standing down in the trough behind them, putting milkers on them. They ride it around and eat. Some point when they're out of milk, the computer senses that, drops the, I'm not a dairy person, so I don't know what the milker things are called, but drops those off. Cow gets over to the other side and it kicks her out, and she's milked. And it's all automatic record keeping. The computer measures flow and how much milk's coming out. It's all sorted by cow, so they have extremely accurate records on what's going into each cow, what's coming out. I'd never seen one before. Some people may have seen a lot of what I'm going to show, but for me it was all new, so I was pretty excited. I thought I had another slide on that, but I might have deleted it last night. Usually I don't go with notes, but there's so much to talk about that I'm going to try and cover everything. There was supposed to be another slide here. He had a 10,000 gallon tank beside each of his barns. So the cows would be in the barn. It's all concrete floors. When he moved them out to milk them, he'd run 2,000 gallons through each barn, just through the floors, flush all the manure out. It'd be clean as it was when it was built. And then this manure was pumped to a solid separation, which there, I set it in the middle there, but it's this thing behind him. It would come in there, the grates would pull the solids out of it, and the water would actually be filtered through the manure and come out and drain into the lagoon. So he could take the solids, he'd let them dry for however long, throw them in the spreader, and then take them out in the fields. And his other benefit was he collected this water, and it had a little bit of fertilizer content. There's some phosphorus in it, nitrogen and stuff. And he pumped this back through his irrigation system. He had a rotary circle, I don't know what they're called, just the circle irrigators, center pivot. And he'd run it back through those and irrigate his fields. And I don't think I have a picture of the irrigators, but he was able to just recycle all his nutrients pretty much. And do what? He had 800 cows at the time, and that varied. He said if they weren't getting enough milk, they'd go buy 100 more cows and throw in. So, and everything was pretty much, it looked like a hospital in their barns. Everything was labeled, organized on shelves, swept clean, no spider web, nothing. And of course, it was all brand new. They actually got $10 million from investors to build this farm, and they expected to pay it off within 10 years, $1 million a year profit. I don't know how it's possible, but they claimed that they could do it. So more power to them. But this picture, I don't know how well you can see it. Is anyone familiar with the rising plate meter? Okay, some of you are. Well, there's several ways to estimate forage availability within a pasture. I think the most popular way, and probably what we do on our farm, is you walk out in it, you look at it, and, well, there's enough here, let's graze some cows. And if you're real technical, you'll measure, is it to your ankle length, is it halfway up your shins, or whatever. And then you have the sticks back there. Well, when you want to start spending some money on forage mass measurements, you can buy a rising plate meter. And what happens is that plate that you see down at the bottom is mounted on this rod, and you set it down in the forage, and that plate will rise up the rod, and it measures how far up it rises. And through that, if you know what kind of, like if this is, actually don't know what field this is, there was some brome grass, but there's different calculations for, you can figure out how much forage is available per acre. So you'll just take that plate, you'll walk through the field and just set it down in like 30 different places, and then it'll tell you what your forage mass is per acre. Actually, a lot of the places we stopped were trying to develop tools for forage mass measurements. And I think this was $3,000, so it was the cheapest of the ones we saw, if any of y'all want to go out and buy one. In Oklahoma, they were developing a sled that they pulled behind a four-wheeler ATV, and between the sled rails, a wing was mounted, and that wing rode up or down depending on how high the grass was. And through the measurements they took from that, it would go into a calculation and give you the same thing. Or in Missouri, they had a laser mounted on the front of their ATV. You would drive through the field, and it would take measurements from the distance from the laser to the ground. So I think the sleds were between $5,000 and $6,000 a piece, and it was $20,000 for the laser-mounted one. So I can tell if anyone wants to come up afterwards and ask where they can get one, I can tell you where to get one. So I don't know how I'm doing on time. We didn't go just to dairies. We did see a lot of cattle and crop places. So this is the Konza Prairie Biological Station in Manhattan, Kansas. And these are buffalo. And I did not realize how much girls of the college age liked buffalo until we were riding the bus around looking at this place, and we saw buffalo on one side of the bus, and I think the bus went up on 2 wheels from all the people rushing to the other side to see them. But this here, they're trying to create a ecosystem that's as close to native prairie as possible, and they're doing some research through this. I didn't realize how much burning was used as pasture management in the western states, and they were experimenting with different intervals between burning. They had some plots where it was 1 year between, 2 years, 5 years, up to 30 years, and they were measuring forage diversity within these plots and forage growth. And one of their big problems is the cedar trees, and they grow they call them junipers out there, but they grow down in the bottoms, and if you don't burn, they'll take over. And so that's become a problem in a lot of places where they have pastures. The cedar trees are taking over. So they're trying to use burning to manage that. Well, now the government in Kansas was trying to ban burning on all farms because Kansas City has the smog detectors. EPA regulates smog levels in all these major cities. Well, there's about 2 weeks in the year in the spring that they're allowed that are optimal for burning. So during these 2 weeks, they might have 2 days where the wind conditions are right, the wind's not whipping around. And during those 2 days, everybody burns. So what happens is all that smoke goes up in the air, it blows east, it trips the smog detectors in Kansas City. Kansas City gets a big fine. So the government politicians in Kansas City realized that where the smoke's coming from, so their idea was to ban burning completely. And it's not going to work. I mean, you'll basically just have plains full of cedar trees instead of prairie grasses. So, but here's some more pictures of the buffalo, and this is them doing a burn in the spring. So basically the goals of this station were long-term ecological research, prairie conservation, which was they wanted a prairie that was similar to the way it was 200 years ago, and public education. They had a old barn and an old ranch house that they had converted into a center. They bring kids from schools in, and they do programs with them. So right next to this was the Kansas State University range beef cattle nutrition and management farm, and I think this was 3,000 acres or something close. But they were doing kind of the same thing. They were using a lot of the native grasses, prairie grasses, to feed their cattle. And one of the things they really valued in their herds were cattle that were adapted to this environment. There's a lot of things. If you took one of our cows off of our farms and put them in that setting, they'd starve to death probably. A lot of these forbs and grasses and stuff aren't what you would normally see here, and those cows won't eat them. So they struggle with teaching producers that there's weeds, and then there's things, as I think a speaker before me was saying, there's forbs and there's weeds. And a lot of this stuff is digestible, is highly digestible, and is good for the cow. The cow just won't eat them, so you got to teach it to consume that. So they also fed, I have some notes on what they did. They fed corn steep liquor to improve a weed. They have Sericea lespedeza. Have y'all heard of that? It's a weed that's become pretty prevalent out in this area, and it spreads really fast, a lot of seeds. And the problem with it is that when cows consume a lot of it, it has tannins in it which aren't real digestible, so the cows will become, they'll have abdominal discomfort, basically have a stomach ache, and so they won't eat it. Well, they found that if they fed corn steep liquor along with the fields that have the Sericea lespedeza in it, it improves the protein digestibility of the Sericea lespedeza, and that way the cows will eat it and you'll still get some growth and stuff off of it. So, and that was one of the big research things we looked at. This is the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas. Does anyone recognize this guy? Okay. Apparently he's really famous. I didn't know until I went out there. But this is Wes Jackson. You know what institute he's with? Well, he's with the Land Institute. He's wrote some books. He's a big advocate of sustainable agriculture. So he was working here developing the Kernza wheatgrass. So the problem, he gave us a talk, the problem with annual wheatgrass is you don't have, well, there's a lot of problems from what he said. You don't have crop cover year-round. The nutrients don't cycle within the system. You take everything out and it's gone. You have to put it back down. So they were developing this perennial wheatgrass, which they called Kernza, and you could plant it and then you'd have the stand for several years. You'd harvest the wheat, stand would come back, you could graze cattle on it and continue that. The problem is it doesn't yield nearly as much. Annuals put all their energy into seed production. Perennials put all their energy into root production. So they actually had one of these, I guess, patches of Kernza that they had dug up, and the roots on it were 30 feet long. And what's sticking up above the ground is maybe 4 or 5 feet tall. So there's a lot of root mass in this. And you only get about 1/10 of the yield of wheat per acre as you do with annual wheats. And the digestibility of what you're grazing is pretty low. So they were experimenting with supplementing on these fields that they were grazing after harvest. They were supplementing other byproduct feeds and stuff to improve your growth of your cattle. So this is some bread. They actually sent us back with Kernza flour, and we made some pancakes, and they weren't terrible. So I don't know how much time I have. That's all the slides I put in. I have a lot more I can talk about, but once again, we really appreciate y'all helping out and donating to us going on this trip. It was extremely educational. Saw a lot of stuff I'd never seen before. Brought back some ideas that I wouldn't have gotten any other way than going to visit. So just thank you. This is our class trip with people. How much time do I have left?
5 minutes.
Okay. Well, I'll talk about a couple other things that we saw that I didn't have pictures of. So one of our stops in Tennessee, we went to Jack Daniel's, which has nothing to do with, it was just a stop for fun. But then we went to Bush's Baked Beans. They have a feedlot. I can't remember what town it is that their main cannery is at, but they have a feedlot outside that town for good reason. They feed all their bean waste to these cattle, and they also, I think they had 500,000 gallons of wastewater every day that came out of that factory, that if they had put it through the local sewage system, they would have had to pay so much money to have it processed. Well, instead, they set up a pumping station and pumped it 8 miles out to this huge farm. I think it was 800 acres, this huge feedlot, and they irrigated all these fields with it. So there's some nutrient value in that water too from the beans, and they put that on the fields, and they actually had some really good growth from that. And they were feeding the bean waste to the cows, and it didn't smell very good. So around that place, but the bean waste is pretty high in fiber. I think it was pretty high in energy, or it was pretty high in protein, but it lacked energy. It was one of those two. And so they fed it and supplemented corn along with it. And the goal of the feedlot was not to make money. They were just trying to break even because they saved enough money by pumping the water out to that farm to make up for any costs that they would have associated with it. So I guess the Noble Foundation was where we saw the big hog trap, and that was really interesting. They did a lot of burn work there. but all their fencing was metal oil pipes. I guess they're maybe 2 inches in diameter, and they have all these extra oil pipes from the oil fields out there, so they put them down on the ground, run braces between them, and run wire on it, and just miles and miles of this stuff. So, and that helps when you're burning off these fields. It burns right through the fence and doesn't hurt anything. So, does anyone have any questions? Okay. Well, I haven't got shocked, so I'll quit while I'm ahead, I guess.
All right. Let's thanks. We'll just go down and just picture this is Vivian Allen that was at Virginia Tech, right here in the center. John Fike on that side. Who's the other instructors?
This is the instructor from Texas Tech. He was an interesting guy. I think he was from Mexico originally. And there was one more instructor, Bridget. She looks like she was still in college, so I can't actually pick her out of the picture. But she was from University of Tennessee, and she did a lot of horse work. I learned a lot about horses, too. We stopped and saw some of her research at the University of Tennessee, and they have a vacuum cleaner that they go around the field, and they vacuum up the horse droppings to keep them from accumulating. So if any of y'all want one of those, I can tell you where to get.
All right. Well, let's thank Scott.